Muito boa tarde para todos. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our presentation as part of the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute. That's PBBI from California State University, Fresno. It is our spring 2023 the lecture and conference series. We want to welcome each and every one of you, those of you following us on the various social media outlets. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you for those who are here. Thanks to the students who are joining in as we speak. There's more and more students joining in, which is good. We are very happy to have this presentation. Happy and honored, actually. That probably the better word would be honored, not just happy, which is to have Dr. Tiago Carvalho, a PhD from Cambridge University, who is the spring 2023 FLAD visiting professor at the Department of Portuguese and Brazilian Studies, of course, at Brown University. And as most of you know, and those following us as well on social media, FLAD, the Luso-American Development Foundation, has been a very strong supporter and actually the main reason that PBBI came to fruition here about 4 years ago. So Dr. Tiago Carvalho is a researcher and lecturer at the University Institute of Lisbon. He is the current co-chair of the Social Movement Research Network of the Council for European Studies. He has been a visiting scholar at various universities in Florence, in Madrid, the University of York. He has just published the book, Contesting Austerity, Social Movements and the Left in Portugal and Spain, published in 2022. And there it is. I actually saw it online, but through Amazon, it's cost prohibitive almost, but I'm sure there's other ways we can order it.
Well, the good news is, sorry to interrupt you, is that it's on open access. So you can download it from the website.
Oh, wow. Well, I didn't know that. That's great news. That is.
I don't have many copies, but at least I can download it.
That's true. That is true. And so the talk is Movements and Transition to Democracy in Portugal. Tiago, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it on behalf of California State University, Fresno, on behalf of the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute, on behalf of our students, our faculty, and our president, Dr. Saul Jimenez Sandoval. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for this presentation that we are all looking very much forward to watching it and learning lots from you, and appreciate your time. I know you're a visiting professor there at Brown and you have a full schedule, and we appreciate the time that you are dedicating to Fresno State.
Thank you so much, Dinesh, especially for the invitation to talk from here, from the East Coast to the West Coast. So can I share, should I share the—
Yes, please do.
Start? All right. Nope, sorry.
It's okay. It was something was coming through.
This.
Okay. There
Okay.
we go. It is perfect.
Now here we have it. No, let me thank you again for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here today talking to you about this topic, which is, I use the catchphrase or the slogan that it's normally used in, when we talk, and we still remember in Portugal in protests and so on, the phrase or the sentence from Zeca Afonso's song, O Povo é quem mais ordena, from Grande La Vila de Morena. And here what I'm come to talk today, it's what's the relation between, and how did social movements related with the transition to democracy in Portugal and the revolution. But let me just situate myself a little bit in this talk and how I come to this topic. I am a political sociologist by training. All my training was from my BA to PhD was in sociology. And so, I started to become interested in social movements and political participation at the end of my degree. And right now I have basically two lines of research. One on globalization or transnational diffusion of environmental movements that I'm working with a colleague at the University of York. And then I have this other line of research concerning collective action in Southern Europe, in particularly Portugal, that I explored already in my book that came out last year. It was my PhD dissertation. But, more or less right now, what I'm really interested and concerned is, and that's what the research that I'm doing here at Brown as well, and the course that I'm teaching, thinking about the historical development of collective actors in Portugal, as Portugal normally is seen as a country with low levels of political participation and disaffection. So I want to discuss that a bit more. And obviously, the transition to democracy and the revolution that you can see one image here, it's a very important point in time that opens up the possibility to protest in a legal way, obviously, because we transition to a democracy. So my whole point for this talk, in a way, is to explore the literature and the work that has been done, obviously, but is to show how these mobilizations from below were important in relation to political parties and the military. So I'll start, first of all, to give you a short introduction about what are the theoretical and not only theoretical, but the work that has been done on the revolution and how they position social movements. And then I'll do one thing, instead of just talking about the revolution and transition to democracy, I'll talk about what came before and what comes after. And so I'll talk about how the so-called long 60s were the breeding ground for a lot of the movements and actors that were then important during the so-called revolutionary period. But then also I will talk about a bit about the outcomes and what can we see from that still lives on from that period. And what were the consequences in terms of institutions and the political landscape that we see in Portugal. So starting from then, from the perspectives on the Portuguese Revolution. The first studies there were studies immediately after. We can't forget that in many ways, social sciences in a country like Portugal were still at its infant stage, if you want, when the revolution happens. You had a lot of scholars that fled the country, but that started working on a lot of the issues concerning that period. But not only, actually the first big studies that appear are in the 1980s, and they are called the transitology studies, which are a group of American, English, or British, and not only, but mainly, that decide to study, or international scholars, if you want, that produce a series of books on the topic of transition to democracy. And Portugal comes as a special case that it's classified as transition by rupture. And this is to contrast with what happened in Spain and other countries, such as Chile, for instance, where actually what you have is a transition by pact, where the leading or the old elites that were in power concede and open up to new political parties and new elites that were pressuring for that same openness. So the transitology is mainly, their analysis is focuses on at the elite level, on the political parties and elites at the state level. they see the mobilizations from below and social movements merely as instrumental to how these different political forces and parties then act. And this is the way that it's actually portrayed in that literature. Nevertheless, as I'll show you, more recently, in the last 20, 25 years, a new literature starts emerging that contests a lot of this assumption. And they actually claim and show how important these players were in shaping up the process. And here, so for the Portuguese case, we have to think of the movements in interaction with two other very important actors: the political parties that are the new elites that would then be formed, in the military who led the coup. So this case actually offers, if we start looking in this way, actually offers invaluable lessons in terms of what the social movements can do for transition to democracy, if we consider what comes before, but also the long-lasting effects of the social revolution. This is the work done by Robert Fishman more recently, and that created a debate that I'll go back in the end. So here you can see the two main figures, political figures that led the so-called Estado Novo, the new state, and Marcelo Caetano to your left, I suppose that is to your left, and Antonio Oliveira Salazar to your right. And the regime lasted for 48 years and fell, and was there was a coup by the military in after 48 years in 74. So what is the context of the 60s, and why does it bring new movements and new groups that start contesting the regime? First of all, we can't forget the importance of the colonial war. During this period, you have the time that we can't forget that the wars last from the beginning of the 60s until 74, 75. The colonial war drafted 200,000 soldiers in a period of 13 years. That means there are some figures for that. If it would be the equivalent to the United States drafting 5 million soldiers for the Vietnam War. Not only that, the war came to 50% of the state budget was for the colonial war. At the same time, Portugal was going through the biggest growth ever due to quick industrialization. And this will be important to explain something in the next slide. As you might know, Salazar is replaced by Marcelo Caetano due to illness. He suffers an accident. And he is then replaced by Marcelo Caetano, who had been the rector of the University of Lisbon and had been for a long time in the state apparatus. And so Marcelo Caetano does what we could call what has been called a Marcelist spring. There was some kind of opening of the regime, but then quickly that was subdued later on, as I'll show. So this is the context of the 60s. And so what do we see? I steal this title, Revolution Before the Revolution, from the book of a colleague and friend, Guia Cornero, who wrote about the student movements in the the big waves of contestation of the student movements during the 1960s. But the point here to make is that the coup and the revolution don't come out of anywhere. It's not a revolution without history. Throughout the 60s, differently from other stages and phases of the contestation of the regime, which you mainly see attempts by the military to depose the regime, what you actually see throughout the 60s, given this economic and political landscape, what you actually see is a breeding ground for new groups and actors. And so we can classify this as a complexification and pluralization of the opposition and resistance. First of all, something that wasn't probably seen for a long time. You have the working class. You had, with industrialization, you have loads and a lot of new industries that emerge in the suburbs of Lisbon. It's not by chance that after in the 70s and 80s, you had the red belt around Lisbon. That was for a reason. Meaning that the PCP would always lead the elections, especially the local elections in those municipalities. So there's the working class with the new industries. There's a lot of migrants coming from from Alentejo, from and other parts of the countryside that start working in these industries and develop new repertoires of contestation that then, and a lot of them horizontal and spontaneous. One example that Ricardo Noronha gives is that when trying to demand, for instance, new conditions in the factory, they wouldn't elect a leader. They would all go together to talk with the owner of the factory, for instance. So, and that was due to the conditions and the political repression that existed at the time. And there's also a liberalization of trade unions at some point that opens up also the possibility for the working class. Then the Communist Party, who had been present since the 1920s, but that was acting underground and had a network underground. 62 and 69 are two big moments for the student movement and the contestation of the student movement that then actually a lot of them become. I was just today seeing an image of Alberto Martins, who then became a socialist MP and an important leader of the socialists, that opens up that period, I think in 69, if I'm not wrong, in Lisbon, or in Coimbra, I'm sorry. And a lot of the student movement then becomes part of the democratic elites during that period. Then you also have the Maoists, and the 60s were also the period of the Sino-Soviet conflict, and there were a lot of splits throughout the communist parties in Europe, and Portugal was not an exception. And so the work of Miguel Cardina actually shows this very well, and how the Maoist groups that existed at the time. So it's very important. Then also there were exiled elites and new political parties being formed. It's at the time still small political groups that were attempting to form, aiming to form political parties to resist and oppose the authoritarian regime. And then the liberal wing that comes, a group of liberal professionals, lawyers, Sá Carneiro, Balsemão, and so on, that were that run to elections, incorporating the regime's party, and try to take the opportunity to democratize, or at least open up a bit more the regime, but that Marcelo Caetano went back, and so that didn't exactly happen. So as you can see, there's all of these groups then become important during that period. So in here you have an image of the emblematic picture with you can see everything, but o povo unido jamais será vencido, with the military, with the carnation, and the working class all together for this revolution. So what we see with the coup, it's actually so we have, if we go back a bit, we see mounting, as I was describing, mounting pressures from the streets, You had more and more working class contestation in factories and so on, and contestation of the colonial war as well, but also internal contradictions of the regime. For instance, as I say in the last sentence here, the military coup by the captain starts to be prepared in 73, and all the top members of the regime were aware of the ongoing military conspiracy, but actually they were not able to stop it. So just to explain a bit where the movement comes from. The MFA, o Movimento das Forças Armadas, forms because due to the lack of officers in the colonial war, the regime decides to make a few changes, and instead of having 4 years of training to become an official, you only needed 1. So there were corporative motivations behind their initial meetings, but those corporative motivations quickly evolved and expanded to a political motivated movement that, had essentially in their program the so-called 3D program: democratize, develop, and decolonize. They realized that without this, the colonial war wouldn't stop. So, and something happened here. All right. So, as there's this excellent book on the opposition by Rabbi, which he says actually it's very interesting and makes the point that I was making until now, that the opposition did not make the coup, but he had done enough to create the crisis of regime, which the MFA exploited, and its component parts had a profound influence on the intense struggles to determine the future of Portugal, which dominated the next 18 months. And these 18 months are the revolutionary period that goes from April 74 to November 75. So this was basically, as you will see, a lot of these actors are important throughout that period. And here you have several images of that period as well. So one thing that we know, or at least we can't look to this period and thinking that everything was decided, but no, actually no, it was a very uncertain period where the possibilities of Portugal turning into a socialist country, let's say, were not out of questions. As Pedro Ramos Pinto tells us, the institutionalization of a parliamentary democracy and inclusion in the Western European family was far from certain in the spring of 74, and it seemed unlikely at several points over the course of the following 2 years. There was the possibility of NATO country turning socialist, and that was discussed at the highest international levels. And also, that was very important to have other international levels. So there was a lot of uncertainty, and social movements actually played a very important role in all of this. So what happens and how are social movements important here? One of the things that argued by many of these new type of literature is that at some point, there was all seems set to a sort of continuation of the regime, but in democratic terms, right? What they didn't expect was that immediate mobilizations in the exact day. So if you see the images from that period, from the 25th of April in Portugal, you see the main images of people in the streets supporting the military, right? And from then onwards, when you have this constant mobilization, I'll show some data afterwards. So while, as Palacio said, as Alice tells us, while the provisional institutional architecture was being negotiated, the mobilization changed the political landscape, speeding up the process and giving it new meaning. So even if the new elites and the elites on the ground, the elites trying to negotiate the new institutions and how they would look like, the political mobilizations and the social mobilizations that happened completely changed the terms of the negotiation. So what you have is, first of all, a state crisis where the old elite disappears. You have mobilizations, very spontaneous and intense mobilizations that create, it was not merely a transition, but actually a revolution. And this is not moving again. All right, so what this does, in a way, and you have here images of the parliament being surrounded by, so you can see the intensity of the mobilizations at that period. So what you have is that this opens opportunities for mobilization, not only for movements, but also for political parties and the military. So it completely changes the landscape. So, and one particular element, and that's why we talk about state crisis, because the repressive apparatus, you lost the political police, the military were out of the scene and they were actually conducting the revolution. And one of the things that happens is that the old elite disappears. And as I was saying, and the transitology literature calls it, it's a transition by rupture. Why? Because the old elites disappear and what you have is only the new elites trying to, in a way, fight each other to see who is going to get into power. So having had all of those movements before, with the opening up of the opportunity structures, what you have afterwards is that a very strong housing movement for better housing conditions. You have peasants demanding lands that they could work. The students also, and also obviously the workers as well. So we can see the street and the ballot box as in opposition, let's say, as this transitology literature tell us. Actually, what they are is what it is an interactive process, as I'll show you. So, and here comes a sentence from Mário Soares, who at the time was the leader of the Socialist Party, and then becomes prime minister, the first constitutional prime minister and president of the Republic. That actually comes to tell us a bit about this. And it tells us, with no previous election, the newly legalized parties had to test their strength by taking part in the social struggles. Until there was an election, until in April 75, political parties didn't know what their value was in terms of votes, right? So in order to make an appearance and to show strength, they would have to go hand in hand with these movements to get more support. So what you see at some point, as you will see, it's this duel of demonstration, especially in the hot summer of 75, where you have a fight between, or a struggle between the revolutionary legitimacy and the electoral legitimacy. Those who said the elections are what we should follow in order to decide how we're going to proceed in the building of democracy, and those who said, no, what we should follow is the revolutionary path and the elections are not important here. So let me show you this by a chronology, with a chronology of the main events and their consequences. So in 75 and in 74, and the 25th of April, the MFA, there's the MFA coup for the reasons I told you. There's immediately popular mobilization that unfolds, and then after a week you have the 1st of May, and there's one of the biggest mobilizations ever in Portugal. But you also have the authorities. Marcelo Caetano actually says, and this is a topic of a chapter that just came out that I wrote with Pedro Ramos Pinto and Guilherme Cornero on the symbolism of the street in Portuguese contentious politics. And one of the things that we say is that meaning starts to emerge during the revolution, when Marcelo Caetano actually says, I don't want to, instead of surrendering the power to the captains, he only surrenders it to a general. Spinola saying, I don't want the power to fall into the streets. So that happens actually. And so you have the formation of the first provisional government with all the parties that existed by then. That changes over time. The next big event is the end of September of 74, called when Spinola, emulating de Gaulle, calls for the silent majority to intervene. But actually, there's a whole process of mobilization from the population to build barricades around Lisbon to stop all the movement of people that would come from other parts of the country, and which the military intervene as well. And the main problem here was a difference. Not only Spinola wanted a different type of regime, but also another problem was with decolonization, as Spinola still wanted to keep a federal model. And so the consequences are that the MFA, the military, assumes more protagonism, and the process radicalizes. The next big event is another attempt by Spinola to take over, and this completely changes the landscape. The radical factions of the MFA win positions in the fourth provisional government. The parties, the political parties, accept that the MFA can intervene over the writing of the constitution. And you also have from here onwards nationalization. Well, nationalizations also happened because there was a lot of capital flight. And so the government needed to take over a lot of industries, but that's another story. But that happens with this, as the process radicalizes, there are nationalizations, and the parties accept that the military have more intervention over the constitution that is to be written, and the political aspects of the regime, of the upcoming regime, and popular mobilizations continue as well. The next big thing is actually the elections of April 75 that had to be postponed and actually happened a year after the coup happens, and they had to be postponed because of this previous event. But actually what it shows is that the socialists and the center left and the center right actually get most of the votes, and the communists only get 13%, even if they seem to be leading the whole process before this. So this creates a split and divisions. Even if there were tensions, the elections create a split between those of the revolutionary bloc led by the communists and those leading the electoral legitimacy bloc led by the socialists and the center-right party, the PPD, that then becomes PSD later on. So this is a critical event that leads to the 8th of July, where the MFA actually approves a more radical political project in a meeting that they have. And so the military decides to do this, or at least a faction is able to approve this, and then the socialists, those who had won the elections actually decide to leave the provisional governments and then are in opposition. This situation leads to splits between moderates and more radical factions of the MFA. And in the north of the country, you have anti-communist mobilizations that attack communist headquarters over that period. And so this leads to what the so-called hot summer, where you have a lot of mobilizations that continue until at least November. But the situation starts to change a bit in September 75. Actually, there in the summer, there's this so-called, the moderates write a document that asks for a third wave that combines socialism with other elements, and that takes into account elections as well. And so these moderates win the assembly, and the winning party, the electoral, those who had won the elections actually returned to government. And as a response, there's an extreme left alliance between PCP, the communists, trade unions, and other groups as well. But what this does is a even broader politicization of the social movements on the ground. Just seeing how I'm doing with time.
Plenty of time.
Yeah, plenty of time. Yeah, I still have a bit to talk about. So, right. So, the last big event, the critical event that happens in this period, it's the 25th of November of 75, in which happens due to some changes in the military leadership, but that actually the more moderate factions had been preparing to. Although I must say, there's still a lot of doubts exactly on what happened. When you look to the history, what the research the historians have been doing, and so on, there's a lot of unknown still. So I'm going to give you a particular interpretation of this. So you have those, the moderate parties back to the provisional governments, and as this conflict evolves, the moderate military, which had won the assembly in September, and are now controlling most of the strategic state positions. And they put in place a plan in a way to control the remainder of the left. It is here that on November 25th, when an attempt coup by an unhappy military division over the replacement of the military leadership of the Lisbon area that was led by Professor Carvalho, who had planned the operations for the 25th of April. It's here that the moderates activate, and moderates, obviously in comas, activate their plan to stop the insurgency and dominate the state apparatus, because that's what it was all about by then. It was an attempt to dominate the state apparatus. Moreover, research has shown that despite the apparent radical mobilization during this period, and this is the important point in where the social movements actually come to play a very important role as well, because we tend to think that they were still mobilizing for the revolutionary path, but actually what the research shows at this point is not exactly that. The research has shown that despite the apparent radical mobilizations during this period, the 25th of November failed because of the active intervention of the masses. For instance, Pedro Ramos Pinto detailed research on the urban poor and the housing movement during this period clearly shows that these groups did not simply accept the radicalization process led by the revolutionary bloc and directed their strength towards democratization, and here I quote, an active choice by the rank and file, not an instruction from above, end of quote. And Palacio Cerezales also shows us that the anti-communist popular violence that ends up with a sixth provisional government, with a new provisional government, ends with that particular government because many of them plead for democracy. They were not only anti-communist, they all plead for democracy. And so, as such, Ramos Pinto shows that despite the apparent support and radicalization of the housing movement that he studied in detail, upon the attempted coup, most groups in the Portuguese capital did not support it. And so, the more revolutionary part of the transition to democracy comes to the end with the more radical factions of the military and control. And so democratization proceeds with popular support. So as it is clear here, what we can see is that this is not only an elite or grassroots process, but rather an uncertain one where the interaction between both was crucial for the outcome. So, and here you can see, this is taken from the work of Diego Palacios Cerezales, actually. And what he sees, what he shows is that until at some point, these ones, I don't know if you can see my mouse moving.
We can, yes.
Okay, good. Thank you, Denise. So what we have is like unitary, when everyone would come together to the streets until 7. Actually, it corresponds to the phases that I was just telling you of March 75. It is here in the hot summer that you have the more radical and anti-communist protesting, as you can see after 75, November 75, the protest almost disappears. So it gives you, this is the number of protests that he collected through diverse number of sources in his research, and that it's always good to be able to see it in a quantitative way. It also tells a story. So, so the transition to democracy, one interpretation, and this is the interpretation that I've been giving in the last few months. So the transition as the foundational moment of the Portuguese democracy, what you actually have is that, and it's a possible argument, not the only argument. One possible argument is that the latest stages of the revolution and at the peak of the conflict, the communists took a defensive position when understanding that they could not come to control the state apparatus, and it was losing terrain to more radical forces. In order to keep their position, it conceded to the moderate forces and domesticated mobilization. So at the extent to the exchange of being integrated into parliamentary democracy, they would give mobilizations away. And so in the period where the state power collapsed, there was an infight between electoral and revolutionary legitimacy. What is interesting is that the popular movements were an arena where the communists and the various small radical parties, mainly Maoists, fought over this legitimacy. And in the end, the communists end up being crucial to democratic institutionalization and to avoid civil war. Social movements brought the revolution and shifted the field, being important in the concessions being given by the institutional actors, but also at the peak of the conflict, they were crucial to stop a takeover by the revolutionary bloc. So you end up with this four-party system with four main parties: the communists, the socialists, the social democrats, and the popular, that then becomes the Popular Party later on. But actually, what happens is that you have what the political scientists like to call a regime cleavage, where that defines who is in power, or even if the communists can participate in the parliament and so on, they are actually excluded from government. And so there is the regime cleavage that exists. All the other parties participate in government, the others don't. And also that later extends to the left bloc that emerges in 99, that's created in 99. That seems to be changing now, but after the 2015 elections, but we still need to see what's happening. So just to show you one other outcome is that this comes from my book. It's the number of contentious player, the three types of contentious players, social movement, because I map a little bit what the protests and movements and conflicts throughout the 80s and 90s before getting to austerity. And actually, we have three types of movements: social movements, the darker ones, trade unions, which are these ones, and political parties and actors. And so what you can see here between 84 and 86 is the outcome, or we can argue, because it's still a leftover from the revolution, because what you have here is political violence from FP25 that appear here as there were a terrorist group that were unhappy with what happened during the way the transition happened. And so you can see here still some remainings of some people here. So and I'm get to the end. So, but I still want to discuss a little bit. I still have a few minutes. So to discuss the legacies in terms of and some of the literature that has been used and how they've been thinking about, because you have the work by Robert Fishman that published a book recently in 2019 about the long-lasting impacts of the types of transition that Portugal and Spain had, and comparing them. And so Fishman, from this comparative perspective, has been arguing for the positive outcome of the revolution, because it reversed hierarchies that still remain in democratic practice. And so it is true that the revolution led to one of the most progressive constitutions in the world. However, as Ramos Pinto and Cornero point out in a text recently of 2022, the fact that you have this symbolic and discursive presence in the public sphere does not really mean a real impact. In the text that I wrote with Pedro, and we show that actually movements and other actors defend the conquistas de Abril, the conquest of April, which is sort of status quo that was a status quo weapon against austerity and merely defensive. And you had other ones defending that the revolution would stop at its highest point with the possibility of a commune of Lisbon. I learned this recently when I was presenting my book back in November in Lisbon with one of the guys that defends more of this position, and that the revolution is unfinished. And so it's actually interesting that if we think about from the intellectual sectors of this latter group of the unfinished revolution, actually comes a challenging perspective for the work of Fishman, which because the argument is that the stop of the revolution allowed for the capitalist class to recover their position over the following decade, and in which the 25th of April, now these days, in their perspective, emerges as a centerpiece of a legitimating discourse of the revolution. And so if they are right, what actually means is that Robert Fishman actually, what he argues is a mere reproduction of the discourse of the regime, and that the revolution was domesticated. I mean, I'm making a discussion here. I'm not arguing for this. The revolution obviously had an impact in the way that the democracy was fought and structured in Portugal, and still is. And that one of the centerpieces for that is how it's more and more contested by the new political parties that emerged on the right. They know if they want to bring about new policies, they have to contest the legacies that still remain in institutional practice, in parliament and in the streets. And so then I think with these new political parties on the right that emerged, it's going to be the next few years are going to be interesting to see how these memories of the revolution are going to be discussed and defended as well. And I'll finish here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tiago. Appreciate it. If there are any questions, please, we still have, if Tiago's available, we still have about another 8 minutes or so.
Yeah.
And so if there are any questions, I know I have a couple myself.
All right.
Well, it just, if we look at the Tiago, and please, those of you in attendance, or if you are on social media, I'm monitoring that as well. And we're monitoring that as well. So you can post them there. It's harder to see, but we can monitor. And of course, those here can do the chat as well. One of the slides that you showed, which of course was the election where the PS had 37% of the vote, and the PCP, and these may not the initials may not mean much to our audience, but the PS, the Portuguese Socialist Party, and the PCP, the Portuguese Communist Party, so had 13. So basically, they could have governed had the PS agreed to an accord with the PCP. They could have governed with 50% of with a total majority in the parliamentary system, which is over 50%.
Yeah.
There's never been much other than the so-called geringonça that was put forth a few years ago. There has never been much of a working relationship, or has there been, between the PS and the PCP?
So you mean if there was a working relation in the years after?
Yeah, and at that particular point, I mean, there was a working relationship here recently with Antonio Costa and the first few years that he governed, because it was a geringonça, a parliamentary, not a governmental coalition, but a parliamentary coalition,
parliamentary pact
with the PCP and the left bloc. However, if we go back to all those years, 40 some plus years ago, almost 50 years ago now.
49.
49 this year, and the elections, the following year, those two forces had a majority, yet they did not govern.
Well, that's
together, I should say.
Together, actually, and that's what I was saying from that those. Like when the coup happens, it's not like in Spain where the governing elite or the ruling elite were making concessions.
Correct.
So all of these political parties were trying to fight for their ground, right? And the PCP and the PS had very different positions about what they wanted, and so they both wanted to be the ruling parties in the system and so on. So that's why, and then they also defended different positions, and the communists also had the support of a big chunk of the military. So the process had to be, they had to continue in the streets as well, right? But it's interesting that you say that there was never a working relation. There are some pockets of collaboration in Lisbon in the years before. Jorge Sampaio, I think, if I remember correctly. I was very young then.
Yeah, but yes, Jorge Sampaio did have a kind of
actually runs to the. So there was always a part of the socialists of the center left that was open to negotiate and to have a working relation with the communists, and that, and that also. Antonio Costa in the municipality also worked when he was the president of Lisbon. He also worked with other parties and established a sort of geringonça in his way in Lisbon. So there were antecedents to this. That it never happened at the parliamentary level. I actually did some calculations about if that was mathematically possible in the elections before, and I think 2015 is actually the first time that you had that configuration that led to the pact. So yeah, there was also a deal by necessity, right? They had to do it in a way if they wanted to survive.
Yeah, and I know that you've worked extensively and studied extensively about the austerity movements, and so this do you feel that this, and from your research and your study and your writing and readings and observations, do you feel that the first geringonça of the modern age, let's say, of the last few years, had a lot to do with the austerity movement that had been put forth by the prior government? And in other words, the PS had technically not won, but it did win, with the parliamentary accord.
Yeah.
And did this drive the other left leaning or totally left forces, such as the PCP, such as the Bloc de Esquerda? Did it kind of drive them to have a different motivation factor that they didn't have throughout years prior to that?
In a way, yes. So let's see if I can do this in a very simple way. So basically, there was, differently from other countries in Southern Europe, Portugal did not have a new political party in parliament like Syriza or Podemos that could influence the parliamentary deals that would happen, right? So that's the first one. That is also because, in a way, and that's a paper that I'm writing right now, but it's also in my book, the political parties had a huge influence in the way that mobilizations happen in the streets. So some kind of new message didn't really appear. What happened was a strict defense of the leg. That's a paper a chapter that I wrote with Pedro. There was a strict defense of the conquests of the revolution. So that helped to keep in place this message that the revolution and the austerity was going against the legacies and all the social rights that had been won through that transition, right? So it helped to keep in place that message. And also that deal also comes out of need, in a way, as I was saying, but also because all of these parties wanted to displace the right wing, to not continue austerity. They saw it as an absolute need, because they could have played a longer game. They could have, because Antonio Costa at that point, if I was in Antonio Costa's hat, I would think, okay, now either I support the right wing to have a government and I resign because I'm in no position, or I lie and survive with these guys, So in a way, the left wing could have played a longer game, and they could have led to what happened in Greece with the Pazos, with the center left party that was replaced by Syriza, right? So in a way, that was what happened. And I'm not going to extend much more my
Sure. There's a question. Álvaro Cunhal. And Mário Soares ever met. What was the result of their conversation?
I mean, they met a couple of times, yes.
Correct.
But I'm sure of that, and they had very hot and intense debates in the television over that period as well. They're, very well known. They met, but I think they probably they were in opposite camps when it came to how the revolution and transition should go about. So initially they were allies, of course, they were all allies, but as the process unfolded, that's why it's very important to look at the process. They are in completely opposite camps in a way. So yeah.
And we're just about out of time, but I wanted to ask you because you touched upon there at the end, the emergence of some so-called far-right parties, and in Portugal, namely one, the Chega, who actually occupies, the third most voted party?
Yeah, right now it is, yeah.
Right now. And you mentioned, Tiago, that sometimes they look at when they emerge, or when these forces emerge, they look at all the challenges, let's put it that way, to use kind of a diplomatic word, of the revolutionary period to kind of justify, their existence now, and and kind of say, well, we told you so, or this or that. So how do you see these movements? Are they a temporary thing, or is it something that like in some of the other European countries, as you well know better than we, and especially some of the Eastern Bloc countries, it hasn't been that long that they've been out of the Eastern Bloc, and now they're looking at these autocratic, very right figures.
Well, if Portugal is going to end up in that situation, I don't know, right? It's hard to say. Time will tell. There's a lot of things that can happen. There's a lot of different scenarios. The truth is, Portugal and Spain, which were seen as exceptions that didn't have any radical right party, over the last few years, those became essential and key players in Portuguese democracy, right? So I don't think they will go away. That's my, that doesn't seem like a possible scenario. I think actually Portugal is going to become closer to other European countries in that scenario, because so in Portugal you always see the left dominating protest. I think actually what's going to happen is you're going to see these right-wing parties using mobilization in the streets as well. And so in that sense, Portugal is going to become a bit closer to other European democracies, that, mobilization in the streets also happens. So I think that that's going to become more of a trend in Portugal. And also this happens because the center-right party is not able to challenge and present new alternatives. But, we'll see what happens in the future. I mean, yeah. But I do think that this party is here to stay. Correct.
So, and with the appearance of Chega, and some of the other parties, IL, Iniciativa Liberal, and a couple other ones, and the other party that you talked about from the very first election that always had a position in Portuguese politics, actually was part of government, which was the CDS, is practically disappeared from the scene. Have these other parties kind of just taken over a place that was occupied by the CDS?
I'm trying. I think most would happen, if I can remember correctly, in terms of like the vote transfer. Actually, most of them probably went to PSD in a way. And for instance, who votes for Chega actually in the last elections were disaffected and people that normally didn't vote or abstained, and then people from PSD. Actually. So, and it's actually interesting because I was actually teaching here, and one of my students asked me, so who are the leaders of Chega? We know that, we kind of know already what the profile of the voter, but actually who are their leaders? There's still not a study done about that. But from observations done, most of them are previous, Ventura himself, come from the PSD structures. They were previous militants of the PSD, for instance. So don't come. Some of them come from CDS and take a lot of the teams from CDS, but they actually don't. Most of them apparently don't come from CDS. So it's very interesting that it's a split sometimes from PSD.
That is very interesting indeed. That is very interesting. Yeah. One would think as an outsider in looking that it would be mostly a CDS, but then the CDS and traditionally has been right, but has not been right. In other words, because of
CDS been always changing their electoral. They always run with different slogans and different. Mobilizing different constituencies. So Paulo Portas was very, very smart in the way that he did that, right? So always changing the way that the party looked like. So when they lost Paulo Portas, maybe they lost their main
Well, they lost someone that could communicate with people in various aspects. It's true indeed, because they were able to get some votes even from the left, as we all know. Well, thank you so much, Tiago. This was fascinating.
Thank you so
I am
much.
sorry I kept you over time.
No, that's absolutely no problem.
I appreciate
it's a pleasure
it,
to be here.
and we all appreciate it. On behalf of Fresno State, thank you so much for this fascinating talk. Thank you all for joining us. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.